Hey fearsome friends. There's something incredibly eerie about being alone out in the wilderness, and these stories will tell you why. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. Now I know he's out there, because just last night the state trooper pulled up to my house in his sheriff's truck, then stepped out of the vehicle and walked up to me. By this point I was pretty much standing on the front porch just waiting, holding a pan in my hand as a way to defend myself. "Hey Mr. Butler, how are you?" he asked. "Doing just fine, thank you, sir. How is your day?" I replied. "Oh, not too great. We're having an issue with that convict that got out. He broke out of his cell about a month ago, out of Nye City Prison," he said. He went on to tell me that there were 2 missing hikers, and it looks to be foul play. They have reason to believe that this convict had something to do with it. Either that or they were murdered by someone else entirely. I said, "I thought they were just missing." "No, we found human remains about 3/4 of a mile out from the basalt mine off of the trail." He said the corpses smelt bad, and one had a gunshot wound to the head. The other one had one in the head too, and they suspected they'd been shot in their sleep. "So there's an escaped convict who's dangerous, somewhere in these woods," and the trooper continued. "Bunyan, the state deputy, wants to send you to a motel in the city for a few days. Don't be alarmed, as we're just worried for your well-being. We can take your pets to the station for the time being, as the motel won't allow them." "Absolutely not," I said. "Me and my animals are going to stand our ground out here. And if I die, then it'll be the State Department's fault for taking away my guns, leaving me defenseless. Thankfully nothing came of it, but I'm still very wary about what is in those woods." So when I, a 35-year-old non-binary, was 16, I was on my Duke of Edinburgh Silver Award expedition, which is a sort of citizenship thing for teens and young adults. Comes in gold, silver and bronze levels, and involves going on an expedition in a group of 4 to 7. We were hiking and planning to cover about 60 kilometers in 3 days to meet the requirements, and you have to avoid roads as much as possible, navigate by map and compass, and carrying literally everything you need in a backpack. Day 2 of the hike, and we'd been going for most of the day, when we were heading down what we thought was a bridle path towards a road which we needed to walk along for 100 meters or so. It was to link up with another footpath, so we could keep going cross-country, when we got to a pond that wasn't marked on the map. No problem though, it's borderline for the size that you'd expect to see marked. Then as we went a bit further, we realized that there was a crossroad, with 2 paths meeting, and the second path definitely should have been marked on the map, but wasn't. Much debate began, and we'd been standing there for about 5 minutes, going over the map trying to figure out where we were, when suddenly we heard an engine coming towards us. Now this was weird, considering you're not supposed to drive on bridle paths, and we saw a little van coming towards us, so moved off the path because it's hard to tell someone off for driving on a bridle path after they've run you over. The van went past us a little, then stopped and reversed. It was a middle-aged bloke driving, and he leaned out and asked if we were okay. We said we were, then asked if he could tell us the way to the road, figuring even if we'd taken the wrong path, roads are far enough between that it should still be the right road, and we can reorient from there and get back on track. But then it got weird. He pointed to the path we'd come down and said, "Yes, you just go down there past the pond. It's about 10 minutes. Tell you what, why don't I give you a lift?" We politely declined, saying it wasn't allowed, but he got out anyway and opened the back of the van. It was carpeted and had what looked like cameras and light equipment, which he started moving about as he was telling us to get in. We refused again, explaining we'd be breaking the rules, and besides, even if the slip was telling us to go the way he didn't know we'd come from, hadn't weirded us out. The equipment definitely did. Eventually he gave up, closed the van and got in the front and left, by going down the branch we'd come from. The one he'd told us would lead to the road that we knew didn't, which was also not the branch he'd been about to go down before he reversed to speak to us. As soon as he was out of sight, it took us about 5 nanoseconds to decide that we were definitely not going either of the ways he'd seemed interested in going down. Thank you, but no thank you. So we decided to go down the branch he'd come from, reasoning that he couldn't have been running around back paths forever, and if he did come back looking for us, he might be less likely to look the way he'd come. We reached the road in less than 10 minutes, and this was the single most creepy experience of my teens. We'd literally walked along the road behind a hedgerow, so we'd be harder to see from the road for a mile, until we found a phone box. We then called our expedition leader and got him to pick us up. Whilst we were waiting, we heard engines 2 to 3 times and dropped to the ground behind the hedgerow, scared it was the guy looking for us. I think all of us ended up in tears in the back of the minibus once the adrenaline had worn off. Now, I've been backpacking and camping, mostly solo as an adult for the majority of my life, and I'm cautious about my surroundings, and I listen carefully when I'm out. I tried to remain an observer and move through the land with little impact, but I'm also very interested in the mysterious and obscure, cryptids, alternate realities, and the unexplained. I've read most of the missing 411 cases. I think Paul Lides is experiencing the confirmation bias, and I'm a serious devotee of true crime. All of the morbid and curious things I can find, anything strange that will fire the imagination. There have been occasions where I've felt slightly uncomfortable, or watched even when I've been out in the woods, but mostly I've chalked it up to being alone and alert. Maybe my inherent skepticism makes me less susceptible to encounters which others experience, as I look for logical conclusions first. I've never encountered any truly off or deranged people out in the forests, but I do consider that the biggest threat, the human animal. A few years ago I set out to camp near an old-growth forest in North Georgia. Most old growth here is gone, but there are places that haven't been logged, and if you get the chance to visit one, wherever you may live, I'd suggest it, as it's beautiful. It's serene and alive in a way that's hard to describe, and this particular forest was one of hemlock and poplar, and the trees were massive. I had a guidebook that gave directions out into the sticks, following little country roads that eventually turned into gravel. After a long drive into a national forest, I parked near the trail, which was unmaintained, meaning it wasn't very popular or highly travelled. I hiked out through the woods to where the trail eventually just kind of stopped, and there was very little undergrowth. I spent the afternoon just exploring and looking at the trees and enjoying the calm, when I eventually made my way down to a creek and crossed over it to an old field that formed a sort of bowl in the land with hills and ridges on all sides. The fact that there was a field means that there had, I guessed, at one point, been people living in that area. But I saw nothing of the sort when I was there, and my maps showed that I should have been far from any roads or settlements. I set up my tent and made some food, and it was late when I decided to have a little smoke, lay out in the field in front of my tent, and look at the stars before bed. There was little to no light pollution, and I always relished the opportunity to enjoy the sky at times like those. But as I was lying there, I began hearing a loud knocking sound from up near the ridge where I'd been earlier in the day. It was maybe 1,000 yards away. There were 3 knocks, a long pause, then followed by 3 more knocks and repeat. When I say knocks, though, what I mean is a very loud noise like 2 logs or trees being hit together, loud enough to reverberate in the little bowl I was in, and loud enough that you could almost feel it. I could pinpoint where the sound was coming from, but it was night in the forest, and anyone who's been out there knows that it's dark. I thought it had been a person making the noise, because what else could make such a rhythmic sound? It was extremely loud and would have taken considerable effort to produce, but I'd seen no one else at all during the day, and the direction from which the sound came was the section of old growth I'd explored earlier. Eventually the sound stopped and I went to bed feeling like I'd heard something I wasn't meant to, or maybe that I'd heard something specifically meant for me, and me alone, to hear. I packed up and hiked out the next day, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't hyper-aware, waiting for something else to happen, but thankfully nothing did. I've told friends about this, and they'll either say it was for sure a Sasquatch, or that I was definitely close to someone's house that I hadn't known about. But why would a person be out in the woods late at night, banging logs together in the dark? My partner, a 22-year-old female, was at a bachelorette party at a campground. I wasn't invited for reasons of being a male. The audacity, I know. But stayed up late in case anything happened. When she called me at 12 a.m, panicking and saying, "He was just in there." I had her recount everything after taking a few breaths, so this is her story, not mine, but I was very much involved. After a fun day and night of drinking, playing games, hiking and swimming, they decided to call it a night. We will call my partner Mindy for this story. So Mindy decided to finally take a shower after everyone else was turning in, and walked over to the camp bathrooms. She noticed an older white male sitting on a bench, but he didn't pay her any mind, as he was listening to something on his phone. She assumed that he was waiting for someone, or was just sitting on a bench at night, as campgrounds are full of strange bench sitters. Now it was one of these timer showers where you push the button to get the water to go, so her shower was very short, and as she had brought her clothes in with her, she got dressed. Just then she heard someone else and assumed they'd needed to use the shower. But as she opened the curtain, she saw the man peeking into each stall, one at a time. She was the only person in there, and all she could do was stand there, mouth agape, and stare at the man. He realized someone was standing there, and when he saw her, his eyes became wide and he sprinted away. I told her that the ranger or camp staff should be nearby and to let them know immediately, or just call the police. But since she was at someone's celebration, she didn't want to upset anything. I figured there was some shock though, and didn't want to raise her anxiety by arguing. But still, neither of us slept that night, as I waited for her calls and she waited for a man to break into the tent. She told the ranger the next morning and they said, "We got several reports yesterday about this man, but no one can seem to find him," flabbergasted that the man had once again caused discomfort. It seems to me that he was trying to muster courage to potentially do something worse, as it was a whole day of stalking, hiding, waiting, and sneaking into shower stalls, but that he was still timid. I'm just glad she got home safely, and I really wish I had been there, because I'm the guy who runs towards explosions, which I literally did once, and would love to satisfy my contained bloodlust by beating down a villain. Now this might not be your typical creepy encounter, but it's kept me up for a few nights now. For some background, I'm a male in my late 20s and living in northern Canada. Last weekend I got a call from a friend telling me that while on his skidoo ride, he went by my cabin as it was on his route, and that it looked like someone had broken into it, smashing out all the windows. Devastated, I went out to my shed to load up my skidoo and sled with boards and tarps to repair the windows, hopefully to keep some of the snow out of my cabin until I could properly replace them in the spring. But just as I was about to leave, I got this gut feeling that something was wrong, and that I should take my rifle just in case, as it's better to be safe than sorry. As I started my ride into the woods, I noticed the sky getting darker and thought to myself, "Grain. Now I'll have a storm to deal with too. But luckily it wasn't a snowstorm, just a thick fog that rolled in fast. Now there's nothing more unsettling than being alone in the woods, encased in a thick fog, especially with God knows what around you. I finally arrived at my cabin, and sure enough, all of my windows were smashed in. So I unloaded my gear and got to work, trying to get my cabin secure as fast as I could, so I could get the hell out of there. When at some point I felt like I was being watched, which gave me a lump in my throat, because I couldn't see anything because of the fog. I then heard something moving through the trees, so I automatically grabbed my rifle and put my back to the cabin, hoping that if something did come out of the fog, I'd be ready for it. My first thought was that it was the asshole who'd broken into my cabin, coming back under the cover of the fog to see what else they could take. But then I realized that no skidoo had approached, as I would have heard one from miles away as it's so quiet. After waiting a while with no more noises coming from the woods, I went back to work and got my windows fixed, returning back to my skidoo to get the hell out of there. After a short ride though, I noticed something that looked like potholes in the middle of the trail that turned out to be polar bear tracks leading towards my cabin. That creepy feeling of being watched and the noises from the woods was a polar bear stalking me and was the actual culprit of the break-in at my cabin. What disturbs me the most though is that I would never have seen it coming with all that fog that day, and my rifle would be practically useless against such a big animal. To this day, I feel lucky to be alive. This isn't my story but my aunt's, who told me a couple of weeks ago, and I want to kind of get it off my chest. It was 1972, and my aunt, being the youngest in her family at the time, had less pressure than her siblings to get into a good job early, or find a nice guy to get married to straight out of high school. She's always had a fascination with police investigation and wanted to be a police officer. At around 15 years old, however, she discovered the world of police forensic analysts, the kind of people that work on dead bodies and autopsy corpses. She was hooked, and being that there was a morgue in town that was severely understaffed, she applied and got in as a basic worker helper, accompanying the family who owned the business as experience. She was 19 at the time of this case, and this was the kind of small town where you'd expect to have something lurking under the surface, and that happened one foggy afternoon during winter. It was in the middle of a massive snowdown when the police were called out about what somebody thought was dumped garbage in a cornfield. The police went to check it out and instead found a dead body. Larger municipal police were called, and by the time they got there it was too icy and dangerous to go back, so they had to bag the body up and place it in the morgue until it could be taken to a bigger department and looked at more closely. One of the things they did ask though, since they'd brought a forensics guy with them for the trip, was that if they could use the morgue's predatory area to do brief examination before turning in for the night. Now my aunt, who was working there at the time, insisted she stay for the exam, and though she wasn't allowed at first, her persistence let her stay, so long as she stayed quiet and didn't interfere. She said they'd laid the body out, which was fully solid due to rigor mortis and the frost, and it was a feminine figure. Pale milky skin, blotchy bruises everywhere, and what my aunt described as the strangest set of anything she had ever seen. There were obvious injuries, missing limbs including the head, but there were also strange inconsistencies. Some things like the head and breast seemed to be removed almost surgically, but one of her limbs seemed to have been torn off with bloody tendrils hanging from where her shoulder should have been. Reproductive organs, upon inspection to her genitals, were also missing, and there was a small hole in her abdomen where the skin had sunk downwards instead of up and made like a bowl shape, and her internal reproductive organs seemed to be missing on account of that. She said the examiner assumed that they had been removed via the vaginal opening on account of a lack of incision. Her hand on the undamaged arm looked like it had been cut off with a saw, and the right leg at the knee looked torn off, Then it was at this point in the explanation to me that she had had enough of talking about it. She didn't end up becoming involved with the police or anything, but instead became a banker and moved out of that town soon after. She said that she realized it wasn't the life for her, but even now and then, she still watches her crime shows. This isn't my story, but was told to me by my mother, 2 aunts and my grandmother, which makes me believe it was true. We're from the inner west of Melbourne, Australia, and in the mid-80s, my mother, 2 aunts and grandmother encountered something described as a very tall man with a black top hat, long black cloak, and a white face with nothing on it but a smiling mouth. The first encounter was when my mother, her sister and a group of friends were hanging out at a local park one night, when the friends noticed something behind the tree and started to call out to it, thinking it was a friend playing a trick on them. And suddenly from behind the tree leapt this tall figure, as described above, who ran at them with giant leaps at an intense pace. They ran for the fence that was described as about 7 feet tall, jumped it, and my aunt only just made it over in time before this thing got to the fence and was staring right at them, head tilting back and forth with its large smile, and was measuring the height of the fence. The second encounter occurred when my aunt had been at her boyfriend's house, which was a few streets over. My mother, another aunt and grandmother walked over to pick her up as it was late, and on their way home this thing appeared again from behind a tree and chased them down the street. Luckily they were close to home and able to get inside before it reached them. But when they got inside the house, this thing just stood there with that same smile and its head tilting back and forth. The last encounter occurred when my mother, grandmother and 2 aunts returned from dinner, and walking up to the house they noticed a light on in the middle room window, where a large wardrobe, which required 2 people to move, usually sat covering the window. But when they got closer, they could see the creature standing in the window looking out at them, again with its head rocking back and forth with the same smile. My mother, grandmother and aunt slept elsewhere that night before returning home with my grandfather, who had been working at the time. When inspecting the house, my grandfather found small tea sets that were being used in the shed, and large muddy gumboots with a trail from the bedroom to the back door, and these gumboots were not a suitable fit for any of my family members. As a child, hearing this made me skeptical, but my grandmother confirmed it and told the story exactly as my mother and aunt had to me. I remember the street as a child, and the house. It was definitely eerie. I wonder what that thing was. Back in 2016, I went on a road trip from Phoenix, Arizona to Estes Park, Colorado to camp with friends. I was driving solo and saw pictures of a place called Mine Canyon that was on the Navajo reservation. It looked like a neat and secluded place, so I put it on my Apple map and headed over to it. I got off the highway whilst in Tuba City and drove about 15 miles to where I'd turn off for the canyon. I thought it was weird that there weren't any signs, and Apple Maps directed me to turn off the road onto a 1-lane dirt track. A mile or so into it, I got to a point where the road descended by a 10 to 15% grade, maybe 150 feet down into a canyon, and it wasn't until I got to the bottom that I realized how steep it was, and also how muddy it was at the bottom. But I continued on regardless. Every minute further that I went, I started to realize that I was in the wrong place. But the road was narrow and had thick desert bushes on both sides, so it wasn't possible to turn around. And to make matters worse, I didn't have any phone service and nobody knew where I was. Finally, I got to the end of the road, which was a point that stood another 200 feet above a valley, where there was a very creepy shack. There was something about that shack that didn't sit right with me. And while it was a nice spot, it was very desolate and gave me bad vibes. The scenery was pretty, so I got out to take pictures. And on my way back to the car, I noticed that there was a person looking at me through this window in the shack. It was far enough away that I couldn't see facial features or expressions, just that they were looking at me. So I booked it to my car, turned around and headed back. But as I was approaching the 10 to 15% grade again, I noticed a big truck at the top just sitting there, and my heart stopped. It hadn't been there before when I was on my way down, and when I got close to the hill, the truck started to drive down it. I knew this meant I had no way out, and I didn't have enough room to get around, as I wasn't able to drive into the bushes. The truck and I slowly made our way closer to each other, as I scanned for places to get off the road and out of their way. But no luck. We stopped about 30 feet away from each other, and I noticed there were 3 men in the truck's front seat staring at me. I gave a little wave and they didn't give anything back, and at this point I had no idea what to do, thinking I was about to die. I was trespassing on their property, and the person in the shack must have notified them. I don't know if it was 30 seconds or 30 minutes later, but to my surprise, the truck pulled off the path and into the bushes to let me go around them. I slowly moved past them then, and as I did, I looked to the left to see 6 eyes and expressionless faces looking back at me. I got to the muddy area at the base of the hill. I wasn't sure I'd be able to get enough speed and traction through to make it up the hill. But I straightened my tires, hit the pedal hard, and thankfully shot up. When I got off the dirt road, I gunned it into Tuba City and out of there as fast as I could. Sometimes when I think back to it, I get knots in my stomach and can't stop thinking about what could have happened if they hadn't gotten out of my way. I was hunting for black bear one day, back in the early 2000s, and the area I was hunting in was northern Clinton County. My ex-brother-in-law and I enjoyed the area and spent many a season scouting and hunting these lands. This part of the county is filled with long hollows, steep inclines and hard-to-access trails, and we both like to do our own thing and hunt separate terrains. I would often dive down into the hollows, whilst he scoured the ridge lines, hoping to get a shot at whatever I pushed over the top. We both carried pretty bumped-up 2-way radios to keep a general idea of where we were, although often the terrain made it too difficult for good reception. This day was a typical bear season day, and it was a Wednesday, the 3rd and last day of the brief season it was back then. The woods were quiet, with no distant whooping or yodeling of various opening day camps, pushing drives through the woods, and the weather was cold, grey and windy when we separated to begin our hunt. I spent the day still hunting down this long hollow, south of a little town in north-central Clinton County, with the intention of meeting my brother-in-law at the top of a ridge at the agreed time of 4 p.m, giving us plenty of time to hike together a few miles back to his truck. After hunting all day, I found an old game trail that appeared to meander its way back up the ridge, towards where I knew he would be waiting for me. So after close to an hour, maybe around 3:30, I made my way 2/3 of the way to the top, stopping often and scouring the slope for that jet-black fur of a roaming bear. When along the trail, I came upon a long-ago-used fire ring. It was very rudimentary in its build, and appeared to have been used only once, as the ring's rocks were covered in lichen and only had the faintest of traces of black from a long-ago fire. I found it odd that a fire ring would be here, considering the steepness of the slope, but it was a very small, somewhat levelled edge, and there I figured I would sit and eat the rest of my packed food, hoping to catch a final chance to see a bear. But all the while it felt odd, somewhat unwelcoming, and like I shouldn't be there. It was almost like I was a forbidden interloper on someone's valued spot. And I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, thinking that it was time to continue the trek upward to my bud. As I stood, I slung my backpack on and reached down to sling my rifle over my left shoulder, when suddenly as I stood up, I heard my name being called loudly. It didn't really sound like it was behind me, rather all around me. Just as I was going to turn around, my rifle was slapped off of my shoulder, and I felt the force, then hearing the sound of something slap against the wood of the stock. I crouched quickly to save my gun from dashing onto the rocks at my feet, and I grabbed it in the nick of time, quickly turning around with a mouthful of expletives for whom I thought was going to be my brother-in-law jacking with me, but there was nobody at all. There's absolutely no way anyone could have rushed off without me either seeing or hearing them, and I felt a sick feeling in my churning stomach. I muttered a few Hail Marys and sped up to the top of the ridge, met my bud, and quietly we hiked our way out of the woods to his truck in the spreading dark of the evening. This has bothered me for years, and I've not been back in those particular woods since. Someday I hope to, though. So about 2 years ago, I was hanging around with a group of mates in a small forest. We've done this more than once and never really had anything weird happen, apart from 2 particular occasions. The first encounter we had was a weird formation of stars, slowly moving around in the sky in a triangle, and within a span of 2 seconds they were moving incredibly fast and out of our view. All 7 of us saw this, so I know it wasn't just my imagination. Then the second encounter freaked us out the most. It happened at exactly the same location as where we'd seen the star formation. It was midsummer and we were just casually hanging around, when around 2:30 a.m., suddenly out of the blue, I saw someone standing very close to us. Now I should point out here that he was specifically standing behind one of my friends, who I'd just talked to 3 seconds ago, and everything about this guy struck me as off. It was about 30 degrees Celsius at the time, but this guy was wearing clothes you'd wear in Siberia during the winter, and he also wore sunglasses, despite it being night. Now the moment I saw him, I instantly felt an intense feeling of dread. The others felt the exact same thing. So I asked him what the hell he was doing there. "Listening," he said eerily. After he said that, he moved a couple of meters, but there was something really wrong with the way he did it. It looked like this guy was gliding over the ground, and he just looked at me, I assumed because I was the one who had spoken to him. At that moment, my fight or flight kicked in hard, as I got the feeling that this guy was a genuine threat. So I got ready to defend myself if he decided to attack us. But just a second or 2 afterwards, he looked at me, then vanished. We were all looking at him one moment, then the next he was gone, just like that. After our initial confusion, we decided we should book it out of there and run as fast as possible out of the forest. We hadn't been using any substances that could influence what we'd experienced. We didn't consume any drugs, alcohol, and we all remember what happened that day. We are also quite well known in that area, as it's quite small, and having been everywhere in there, never have we found any signs of homeless people. Now we have a cabin that is remote, and it's where I stay for work. I'm always told not to go alone for safety reasons, as things can go wrong quickly, and help is too far away. But on this trip, I went alone as usual, as I needed to get work done. I also needed time to get away from the city life, and getting out into the wild is a great way to reset, which is what I needed. My trip ended up taking a long time, and I got into the camp around 1:30 a.m. I stopped the truck, put on my headlamp, and went straight to the warehouse to get the generator going. Then I connected the power and the cabin lit up. There had been a ton of snowfall, so I did my usual inspection to see if I could spot any tracks around the cabin, like wolves, moose, or humans, and thankfully I found nothing. So I headed into the cabin, lit a fire, and cooked myself a late meal. as you can imagine, being out there isn't any cell service, but I did download some movies on my phone to keep me occupied, as it helps me fall asleep. I eventually fell asleep at about 2:30 a.m, and beforehand had decided to add more logs to the fire to make sure it lasted through the cold winter night. But as I was doing this, I heard someone or something walking on the deck towards the front door. You know that sound when snow is being crunched by a boot? That's what it was. And I thought, weird, I didn't hear a vehicle pull up or anything. So I listened. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.